Hey, welcome to Beyond Organic Wine. This episode features Zach Geballe of the VinePair podcast. Zach's experience as a wine and drinks communicator for VinePair builds on years of experience as a sommelier and beverage director in restaurants. He and the VinePair team do a great job of staying informed and having informed perspectives and sometimes strong opinions about the wine and beverage business. So I would describe the pace of this conversation as a full gallop. I originally wanted to interview Zach to provide a counterpoint to my own thinking about hybrid grapes in our wine cultures. I mean, he's deeply embedded on a business side perspective, and I just assumed we'd probably disagree about certain things just from that standpoint. And I saw it as a way to bring attention to the Embracing Hybrid Grapes conference that we just did on January 26th, International Hybrid Grape Day, by the way. But it turns out that Zach and I agree about many things, so many things, and especially in relation to some of these ideas. So what I thought might be a debate became more of a high-level exploration of where we are and what might be necessary to move forward in wine. Though we discuss hybrid grapes, the conversation becomes much bigger and broader. We discuss the conservative nature of wine and wine farming. Are wine farmers inherently more conservative? Is the wine business inherently more conservative due to its slow pace and the significant investments of time needed to make wine possible, among other reasons? How does this impact smaller producers? This conversation will nicely set up a future podcast with Tara Bajalia of Tara Wine Co., where we discuss the importance of smaller producers to wine and why it's worth figuring out how to make it financially possible for small producers to continue to make wine. In discussing hybrids, Zach brings up the need for dynamic tension to be part of the sensual experience of great wines. When we see more of this quality in hybrid wines, he suggests, then they will be able to be more embraced by the wine establishment. And while I agree with him that this quality is important, and I think it's important for producers working with hybrid grapes to keep his perspective and the dynamic tension he mentions in mind, and in view as a desirable quality to aspire to in hybrid wines, we also didn't get too deeply into the many reasons besides the grapes themselves why the quote-unquote establishment hasn't experienced much of this quality in hybrid wines yet. Zach and I also discussed varietal labeling of wine, which ultimately led to the question of what is wine's greatest sin? Zach's answer is important for everyone to consider, and it's so important, in fact, that I'm working on an entire piece about this subject, inspired by my recent visit to speak about hybrid grapes at the Oregon Wine Symposium, and the strong reaction of some young attendees to something I said. I'm obviously not saying much here because I don't want to spoil it. I want you to listen and find out. Enjoy. Zach, welcome. Thanks for doing this.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Adam.
So VinePair podcast is, what you are currently involved with, but you have quite a history in the drinks business, wine, and everything else. Could you talk a little bit about that? Where you came from, how you got your start, maybe some of where your passion arose from?
Yeah. So I will say this. Sometimes looking back at one's life, you kind of realize like, oh, maybe this was a clue of something. And at the moment, I didn't really necessarily pick up on it. And now in retrospect, things make a little bit of sense. But I was always, as a kid, very interested in food. I really liked to read restaurant reviews, and actually made my dad take me to a couple of like well-reviewed restaurants in Seattle where I grew up for my birthday a couple of years, and was always interested in, like I said, food culture. I was a big Food Network watcher, which definitely was not common for, especially boys my age. I'm in my 40s now, and so it was definitely not something that my friends and I were not necessarily chatting about. And then I love to cook, and actually the other piece of this that's funny in retrospect is at least once, I think maybe twice, for my birthday as a teenager, I had a dinner party where I made dinner. And it turns out that at least in the late 90s, early 2000s, throwing a dinner party for a bunch of teenagers was not something that they understood. So people did not show up on time, did not understand that we were eating a meal. So whatever, that was what it was. But I also kind of grew up around this idea of wine in particular, and drink more broadly, kind of as a part of the dinner table and culture. With my dad and my stepmom, they would always have wine on the table, certainly for Friday or Saturday nights, things like that. And I kind of didn't necessarily think that's where my career was going to be heading, but I had a couple of interesting experiences with wine when I was in college, and then kind of thought I was going to go into journalism, which, as it turns out, I did in the roundabout way.
Yeah, yeah.
But then when I graduated from college, I decided that I did not want to pursue broadcast journalism at the time. It was kind of a rough time for journalism, still is, I guess. It was the beginning of a rough time. And I decided to go back to Seattle and work in restaurants, and did that for quite a long time. Just about everything you can do. A very brief stint in kitchens before I realized that I liked front of the house better because the hours were better and the pay was better. And so I did everything from bus tables and work as a barback to serve, bartend, eventually work as a sommelier and a wine director. And all along, I kind of had that going on. And then this sort of interesting sideline in the journalism side that I picked back up probably, 5 or 6 years into my restaurant career, and eventually led to me doing what I do now, which is podcasting and writing for VinePair. So I had this benefit, I guess, in a way of having both a journalism background, which obviously applies to whatever field you're covering, and then for me having real experience. Not that there aren't real valuable insights that can come from people who just cover an industry, but I think there's some benefit to having worked in it. You have a certain perspective that can be hard to achieve just from the outside.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. Yeah, so you went from the very difficult and challenging, with fewer and fewer prospects option of journalism into restaurants. That's
Well, at the
much,
time,
much
that
more.
seemed like a smart move. It was a different restaurant economy in the mid 2000s than it is now. So yes,
No, yeah. No, it's funny. It's the things we love,
right.
you got to go with that.
Right.
Otherwise, what's the point? Yeah, it's funny. I mean, even you, I remember throwing a similar birthday party where I cooked for people, and what I, the silly thing that I did, and totally unselfconsciously, I was like, I want everybody to give a toast. Like, I wanted it to be not just a
Mhm.
place where we sit down and like we eat and it just is like a whatever. I wanted it to there to be some sort of formal element to it where everybody got to like say give a little toast. Did not specify that I was not asking people to toast me, but of course since
Ah,
it was my birthday, all everybody's toasting me, and I was like, oh my god. At the end I was like, no, I meant like creative toasts.
right.
Anyway, that was my
Yeah.
mistake
Nothing,
with the
yeah.
dinner
Nothing like
party.
all your friends being like, man, what an egotist.
Exactly.
Just wants us all to
Exactly.
come over and tell him how great he is.
Strangely, none of them are my friends anymore, so I don't know what happened.
Maybe it was the food.
It probably was. One of them actually, because there was like roasted Brussels sprouts that I'd done in a fun way, and then like asparagus that was like grilled, and I remember one of them being like, "All of my childhood nightmares are represented in this meal."
Well, I'm remembering now that I made bouillabaisse, which was like a bold choice as in
Right.
retrospect.
Right. That is nice, nice. Great. So many things in common, and I have to say, VinePair podcast, for anybody who doesn't listen to it, very broadly, and very journalistic. I think, and I mean, this becomes a question that I want to ask you about, but first, it's a compliment in the what I imagine must be a lot of research and just keeping up with the industry in every way possible, whether it's drinking, the hard job of professionally drinking,
Right.
to just like reading copious amounts of stuff and staying
Yeah.
abreast with everything that's going on, because you guys really do touch on just every element of the drinks, and you guys seem to have pretty well informed opinions most of the time about all of these things. And the other thing I'm jealous about that podcast is you guys get to do it together, which is like one thing that I've wished I had started this podcast with like two other people at least. So for that camaraderie, as well as the
Right.
just the conversational aspect of it, that is a fun part of that podcast. But
Yeah.
so, sorry if you want to say
No,
anything.
please.
I mean, so my question is, to what extent are what kind of research and work do you have to do to be able to make that possible?
It's a good question, and it's funny. I don't necessarily always think about it in a formalized sense, but I would say that probably my work time, I guess if you could put it that way, is kind of divided up into a few different things. So yeah, you're right. I do a lot of reading and listening to podcasts and things like that to have some sense, because one of the challenges for me, especially as the podcast has grown and a little bit changed how we handle things. I mean, in the very early days of the podcast, if you go back and listen to the first, I don't know, I mean, I don't know why you would do this, but if someone really wanted to, you go back and listen to the first 25 to 50 episodes. At that time, it was just my co-host Adam Teeter and I, and it was a lot of us trying to figure out, like, what is this podcast going to be? And we covered a
Mm,
lot of different topics, and some of it was things that in the course of time and as VinePair, and in particular the podcast that VinePair produces, have expanded and changed, that we've found are better fits for other people to cover. And what we've really become is much more focused on the drinks industry and the broader hospitality industry to some extent, trends, things like that. And for me, that's kind of led me to it's challenged me, which I appreciate in a couple of areas. I am not the person who comes to the podcast with a tremendous understanding, did not come to it at least with a tremendous understanding of the business of drinks, really.
mhm,
Adam has an MBA. Adam, is one of the two people who runs VinePair. He obviously has a better handle on that. And for me, my expertise was, in some sense, just knowledge about drinks generally, having, worked with them professionally for quite a long time. And obviously an intimate understanding of how, in particular, the on-premise beverage alcohol trade works, having, again, done that specifically for quite a long time. And for me, that part of it is the part that I, in a way, feel most self-conscious about keeping up because I don't do it anymore and haven't since March 2020 for reasons that probably your audience can figure out. Um, and so for me, that comes down to a big part of my job, which is a part that I love, even though it's sort of it takes a lot of different forms, which is what I consider kind of like source cultivation. And I think any journalist, I'm not an investigative reporter. I'm not getting anonymous tips particularly, except maybe once or twice with some sort of weird news stuff. But fundamentally, it's about just knowing people and checking in with them from time to time. It's having people that I know in markets across the country and a little bit around the world, getting a sense from them, either via email, social media, things like that. Kind of like, what are they seeing? What's going on? What are they noticing in their markets? And for me, developing that, and especially having that be something that goes beyond Seattle, where I live, New York, where VinePair is based, or even just the biggest cities in the country, has been one of the most rewarding parts of it, to have people that I check in with in Boise, Idaho, in Fort Wayne, Indiana, in Nashville, Tennessee, places like that, where some of them get more attention than others, but what's going on in their drinks culture is relevant and interesting to me, and really can sometimes help illuminate some of the topics that we cover in the podcast, because it can be a real challenge for all of us, I think, to not be too narrowly focused on where we are, what we see in our day to day. And I obviously draw heavily on my own experience, what I see when I'm out drinking in Seattle or if I'm traveling in other places. But I do really try to stay abreast of what's going on, kind of, again, nationally, even a little bit globally. And that's definitely some that I get to do when I do travel, but also, again, like I said, it's this kind of source cultivation. And that's both, people that I know. And then again, it's just reading what people are writing, listening to what people are talking about, that kind of stuff is a big chunk of what I do, because again, the goal is not, I think, for the podcast to sound, or I'm not necessarily going to sit on the podcast and be like, and according to so and so, I this is what, but you want to bring that information to the podcast. I want to bring that information to the podcast in a way that is that conveys what I'm glad to hear you, and I think most of our listeners get, which is that Adam and Joanna and I really do pay attention to this industry closely. We are relatively well informed, and we can hopefully convey that in a way that is also reasonably entertaining. And I think that is a part of what's become what we do at the podcast, which is, and it comes back to what you said about having multiple hosts, that it's through the lens of a sort of conversation that the three of us are having. And yes, it's a podcast. We know we're being recorded. So it is a slightly different tone than the conversations we might have off mic. But fundamentally, the goal is for it to feel like that. And I think by and large, we're relatively effective at that.
yeah, yeah. No, I agree. I agree. Yeah, and so your background, if I heard, a subtlety in the way that you described your career, did you take any formal sommelier training, or was that sort of an on-the-job progression that led you into that realm?
So, I mean, in the sense of, like, I passed the Court of Master Sommeliers introductory and certified exams. So, if you consider that sort of formal
Oh,
education,
yeah,
for
even though
folks
it's
who haven't
more
been through that, it is largely a self-directed thing. I mean,
right.
the introductory exam comes with a day and a half long course that you take before it. The certified exam is just a test. As you get further on, which I have not done, there are some, again, courses, but again, the idea behind it is that it's largely self-directed. And I was a part of, and still am, in a tasting group here in Seattle, and did a lot of studying with people as I was in that process. But I didn't go to a school or anything like that for it. My training that wasn't through reading and all that and research was on the job training and all that. So yeah, that's kind of my background, especially as regards wine.
Yeah, I guess that the court is as as formal as I really expected anybody to do.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, like having been through that as well, just that it's not really a course, but more of a test that you
Right.
prepare for, and theoretically have some knowledge. But it does direct what you study.
Yes.
I mean, what you're going to be tested on has a certain focus, so you have to gear your studies toward that. And to that end, one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you is just to get a sense of somebody like you who is in the business, like what you're seeing, what your experience has been, and has it evolved with the use of hybrid grapes in wine, and and so just with starting with a few basic questions about in your career, did you ever work with hybrid grape wine, pour any hybrid grape wine in the restaurants that you worked in?
I was thinking about this question, and I think the answer to that is probably no. And I think it's kind of
Yeah.
for two reasons. I mean, one of them, well, probably a lot of reasons, which I'm sure we'll get into to some extent. But I think there are sort of two. One is, as far as I'm aware, my career was all in Seattle, which was where I live now, and there's not a lot of hybrid grape um, growing that's happening in Washington. Certainly, there's a little bit on the west side of the state, but not very much. And where the kind of wine industry is focused, there's very little cultivation, just for the main reason being that to this point, at least, hybrid varieties have not been seen as necessary for viticulture here.
Right. Yeah.
And I would say that my exposure to them more broadly, I definitely tried a few hybrid grape wines in kind of out of curiosity, but they were very, it was more like me seeking it out because I was interested. I had I remember traveling to North Carolina with my wife, and tasting some hybrid variety wines there. And I mean, a few other smatterings of places, but it's really not until more being in this role and showing at least a little bit of interest in it that I've gotten a few bottles sent to samples and things like that, and had a chance to try some, but I never served it professionally. Just wasn't a part of the program that I was running as I saw it.
Yeah, I mean, and this would have been early 2000s, right? Like that era.
2010s, really. I wasn't running wine programs
2010s,
in the
okay.
2000s, but yeah.
Okay, got it. Yeah, I mean, not surprising at all to me. I
Right.
mean, but especially on the West Coast, it's like the climate in the wine growing regions is, I mean, the reason we're growing wine here is because it's arid and easy to grow
Yeah.
vinifera. So what since then, like what has your exposure been? Like what have you, what generally now, I mean, did you also sort of already sum up what your exposure has been now, where you've had a little exposure to it more, but or is there been anything new or more to hybrid exposure since then?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I would say is that hybrid wines are kind of a part of this bigger, I don't know what I call it, but I don't know if it's a project of mine, but I think it's something that I'm interested in personally exploring and maybe professionally exploring too, which is kind of this question of like, what is wine? Like, how do we define it? Because I think how an individual person or whomever you're asking this question to, be it an individual or a company or even a whole society, chooses to define wine, I think says a lot about them, and kind of there are very hard it's very hard, I think, to create a neat and tidy boundary that doesn't at least leave some people kind of taken aback by what you've decided to do. And so to me, hybrid varieties are one example of this. I think, non-vinifera varieties entirely are another. I think, other fruit source wines or mixed fruit wines, things like that. Again, you kind of get into this space where it's like, well, if we're sort of saying that wine is only a fermented beverage made from Vitis vinifera grapes, okay, well, you can make that claim. I don't think it necessarily has a lot of merit to it. Like, I don't think from any kind of, if you're honestly and sort of objectively looking at it, that can't possibly really be the extent of what wine is. It's not how the term has been used historically and culturally. It's not how it's still being, perceived. And I think fundamentally, it's kind of not don't think there's a lot of merit to that. But I do think that kind of understanding how these different pieces fit together, and especially when you look at, what is kind of commercially viable or seen as commercially viable versus what people are doing for other reasons or because they are viable in their specific markets or things like that, that is an area of I'm quite interested in.
Yeah, that what is wine question is, I don't know if you've done any listening to my podcast, but that was my opening podcast episode for 2024, I believe. I kicked the year off with that question, and it really was like, I just felt like this is, in a way, what I saw the wine industry wrestling with behind a lot of behind a lot of the other debates that were happening at that time. I also put out an episode about like how New World is a problematic term, because of how it positions everybody in relation to European centric thinking, essentially. In wine, the entire world of wine is then positioned with relation to Europe and values of European grapes. But yeah, everything you just said is echoing, the things that that I brought up and continue to bring up, because I think it still is a big part of this, and even more so now because I think hybrids are coming a little more into the discussion. Hopefully, I don't know. That's a question for you, maybe. having started this question, your own queries into what is wine. Do you see any movement in the market at all?
I think what I see is...
Well, that's it for now. If you are not a paid subscriber, if you'd like to become a paid subscriber to get full access to this and all the content at Beyond Organic Wine, you can easily do that at beyondorganicwine.substack.com. Thank you so much. And here's a little music from Colden Pro. A big thanks to him for this.